Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're zooming way out. We're going to take a high-level macroeconomic look at exactly how governments design massive systems to literally dismantle structural poverty. We're focusing specifically on the architecture of India's poverty alleviation programs, or PAPs for short. Because, rather than just crossing our fingers and hoping general economic growth will eventually trickle down to the folks who need it most, these programs are deliberately engineered to reach in and pull people out of poverty. So let's dive right in and see how these frameworks are actually built from the ground up. Here's the blueprint for what we're covering today. First, the mandate for intervention. Then, mapping the target demographics. Third, the dual engine approach. Fourth, the cycle of asset creation. And finally, blueprint versus reality. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the mandate for intervention. So, the very first question we got to ask from a macroeconomic standpoint is, why is direct government intervention even necessary? I mean, why not just wait for the economy to grow organically, right? Well, to answer that, we have to look at a really stubborn economic trap that developing nations face. Economists call this the vicious circle of poverty. Let's actually trace the supply side of this loop. In an underdeveloped economy, productivity is just low. And because productivity is low, people earn a low real income. Now, when your paycheck is barely covering survival, you obviously have super low savings. And when an entire population has low savings, that leads directly to low investment. Without investment, you end up with a deficiency of capital. You literally can't buy the better tools, the better seeds, or the better tech, which, you guessed it, drops you right back into underdevelopment and low productivity. It is this brutal, self-reinforcing loop that keeps the whole system trapped. But wait, it gets trickier, because this trap exists on the demand side too. Take a look at the bottom of this cycle. Low real income means everyday people have very little buying power. That low demand means the overall market size is tiny. So if you're an entrepreneur, your opportunities to actually sell your goods are extremely limited, which completely destroys your incentive to invest. And, once again, low investment leads straight to capital deficiency, looping right back around to low productivity. It's totally self-reinforcing. So here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. An economy caught in these vicious circles really can't just organically grow its way out. The gravity is too strong. And that is exactly where poverty alleviation programs come in. Conceptually, PAPs are direct policy interventions. Think of them as a giant wrench deliberately thrown into these self-reinforcing gears. They are specifically engineered to artificially inject capital, demand, or assets into the system to physically break the cycle. Which brings us to Section 2, mapping the target demographics. If we're going to throw a wrench into the gears, we need to know exactly where to aim it, right? Who are these massive government frameworks actually designed to protect? Well, the source material is super specific about this, because poverty isn't just a monolith. It affects different groups in structurally different ways. PAPs are customized to meet unique needs. Picture a landless agricultural laborer just waiting for seasonal work that simply isn't there. Or maybe a marginal farmer struggling to get by on a tiny plot of land. Think about a village artisan who's totally lost access to modern markets, or families living in remote tribal or hilly areas completely disconnected from economic hubs. The policy design has to be tailored, because honestly, a solution that works for a displaced artisan in an urban center is completely different from what a marginal farmer in a drought-prone village needs. Let's move on to Section 3, the dual engine approach. Let's look at the operational framework and see how the government practically tackles poverty across these really diverse rural and urban ecosystems. The structural intent behind PAPs actually relies on two distinct operational tracks. Think of them like two separate engines. On one side, we have wage employment schemes. These are designed to provide immediate cash relief and manual work, especially during those tough agriculture dry spells. It's rapid, right now intervention. On the other side, we have self-employment schemes. These are designed to provide the tools, assets, and skills necessary for long-term financial independence. It's basically the difference between giving someone an immediate wage just to survive the week versus giving them the capital to start a micro-enterprise that's going to sustain them for a lifetime. To really ground this abstract idea of wage employment, just look at this number, 100. This is the structural mandate at the very heart of MGNRJ, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. By law, this scheme guarantees at least 100 days of unskilled wage employment every single year to every rural household that demands it. It acts as this massive government-funded safety net for when private employment just dries up. And the macro impact of this wage employment engine
It is staggering. The UN Development Program actually cites it as having no precedent internationally in terms of scale. Because it guarantees a minimum wage, it actually forces up overall agricultural wages across the board, which ends up benefiting even the folks who aren't directly in the program. Plus, by mandating that at least 1/3 of the beneficiaries are women, it structurally drives women's empowerment in rural areas, while at the same time reducing the distress migration of people fleeing villages for overcrowded cities.
Next up, Section 4, Cycle of Asset Creation.
Okay, let's look at the intended long-term macroeconomic result here. How do we make sure this isn't just an endless cycle of temporary relief, but an actual bridge to lasting wealth? Let's trace how this flips from a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, on paper. A successful PAP functions in steps. Step 1, it generates immediate employment. Step 2, this raises local wages and pumps cash directly into the local market, which boosts that demand side we were talking about earlier. Step 3, people use this newfound stability to increase their own earning capacities. And step 4, and this is absolutely critical, the labor generated by these programs is directed toward creating tangible, durable, community or personal assets. It is not just a handout, it is a systemic mechanism for structural economic change.
So, what do these tangible assets actually look like? Well, the labor isn't just used to, dig holes and fill them back up. Through various integrated schemes, the workforce is building rural all-weather roads, they're implementing soil conservation and flood control, and they're engaging in actual land improvement. Other self-employment and housing schemes, like the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, help families acquire physical assets. We're talking livestock, tools, or even entirely new subsidized houses. These assets systematically chip away at the very foundation of rural poverty, providing infrastructure that is going to outlast any immediate wage payout. Finally, let's look at Section 5, Blueprint versus Reality. We've spent some time understanding this pristine, conceptual policy design, but what actually happens when this blueprint hits the ground? First, let's acknowledge the undeniable macro successes. The proportion of the population living below the poverty line saw a massive, dramatic decrease, dropping from 55% back in the early 70s down to roughly 22% by 2011 to 2012. Data actually shows that half of the increase in the income of the poor in recent years is directly due to PAPs. Wages in backward regions have risen, and the nutritional levels of the poorest have visibly improved. The wrench absolutely slowed down the gears of poverty. But we also have to talk about the severe systemic frictions. When you impartially review the economic assessment, the real-world implementation is often riddled with inefficiencies. The administration can be totally bogged down by complex procedures. Supporting institutions, like the ones that are supposed to provide credit or market access for those newly self-employed artisans, they often underperform. There are serious, documented issues with leakages and corruption, meaning the capital doesn't always reach the people it's supposed to. Remote areas are still sometimes left behind. And critically, these are often top-down government programs that lack the vital, active participation of the very local communities they are meant to serve. Which brings us to one final vital question. Does the reality of implementation ultimately match the policy blueprint? We've seen just how elegant the economic theory is, how breaking the vicious circle through wage and self-employment engines can, theoretically, build this beautiful virtuous cycle of asset creation. Yet the friction of the real world, the corruption, the administrative bottlenecks, the infrastructural gaps, it constantly challenges this design. So, as we continue to study structural economics, ask yourself, how can future policies be engineered to not just look perfect on a presentation slide, but to actually survive the friction of reality? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.